Here is Pilot Namiki Red, a red ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. This is by far not the best red out there, and it comes up short of being a standard red, but I love it, and this is because I used this a ton on a different channel that I have where I do a bunch of math work, and I'm doing it on a lot of very cheap paper, and it performs so well. This is very consistent across pens and paper in tone, and rarely, if ever, gives any shading. So why do I love it? On non-fountain pen friendly paper, especially the 20-pound copy paper, it performs flawlessly, which is the reason that I used it with this other channel to make all these math videos. I needed something that was going to perform really well and not look like garbage, distracting from the math that I'm trying to teach there. Now, in order to get this, I had to order a bottle, and in order to do this review, I had to order a new bottle because I used up the first one. A perfect red for those that write a lot on copy paper. The pen for today is a Noodler's Charlie. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. What we get in tone is a little bit lighter than a standard red, but not far lighter, not way off, just not there. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. There's a couple of moments, you could call it shading, like cheered on the first line where the CH is a little bit darker than the rest of the word, or guided where the last D is slightly darker. But the amount of shading that goes on is so minimal, I can ignore it easily with this beautiful red ink. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, there's no bleeding, no ghosting, and it will never bleed through to the page underneath. Beautiful. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Pilot Soyo, or Dew on Pine Tree. Here is Pilot Namiki Blue. Here is Pilot Namiki Blue Black. Here is Pilot Namiki Black. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't shade. It just gives a great, almost standard red the whole time through, making this really a standout great performer on these non-fountain pen friendly papers. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, there's no bleeding, no ghosting, and no problem writing back here. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. There's no kind of tone shift that happens for being on this paper, showing that despite the fact that this isn't what looks to be a very rich red, it's very opaque, unaffected by what's going on from the paper. No feather, no spread, a couple of moments of shading before you go looking for it. Look at before on the first line where the B is darker than the E. The FO darken up a little bit. The R lightens some, and the E at the end does get a bit darker. So there is more shading here than we really see on most of the other papers. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue having notes back here. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. While this isn't a super vibrant red, it stands out against this quad rule without any kind of issue, making it a great second color to be able to use on this paper. Now, it's the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. There's almost nothing when it comes to shading here, making this a perfect red ink on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, there's no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Pilot 100th Anniversary Red. Here is Pilot Momiji or Autumn Leaves. Here is Pilot Mixable Red. Here is Private Reserve Dakota Red. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. It continues to stand out well from the quad rule even on this paper. Now, it's the same tone as the Clairfontaine, and this paper has a tendency to make an ink look a bit lighter and duller. It hasn't changed it at all, making this so good. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade. The shading, I think, is a little more noticeable than most of the papers, though not as much as it did on the National. So happy with what I'm getting. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, there is no bleeding, no ghosting, and every student's going to be happy to be able to write on the back of their page. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Pilot Mixable Blue Black. Here is Jeherban Stormy Gray. Here is Pilot Tsukiyo or Moonlight. Here is Pilot Bamboo Coal. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. This gives the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. There's almost nothing for feathering, nothing for spread. I'm looking at them side by side. It's barely thicker lines. It is a tiny bit, but barely. There's no shading. It's an amazing ink on this 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We can easily write on the back of the page with this ink. Both sides writing, 20-pound copy paper, absolutely amazing. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? My Noodler's Charlie is a rather wet pen and fine writing. I find little to no shading and a consistent tone across papers. Off camera, I did put this in a very wet broad and a dry fine. The wet broad had no issues, but the dry fine did make this tone down in color, but neither shaded much at all, if at all. I have come to love this in tone and performance from a wetter fine, and don't think there is a better match for this ink than your wet fine. It is amazing on the copy paper. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.